Every doctor at Massachusetts General Hospital had given up. The most feared Irish mob boss on the eastern seaboard, a man who had built a criminal empire out of blood and tenacity before he turned 30, lay in a private room guarded by armed men, connected to machines that beeped out the slow countdown to his death. 3 weeks after 3 bullets tore through Cormac Riley's body outside his own restaurant in South Boston's waterfront district, there was no brain activity beyond the most basic stem functions. His organs were beginning to fail, and his older brother had already signed the papers to pull the plug in 72 hours. The underworld was circling like wolves. His enemies were carving up his territory, and not a single person who visited that room came out of love, only fear or calculation. But every night, a 27-year-old cleaning woman named Sera Nakamura would push a cart into room 2214 and do something no one else did. She talked to him. Not because she knew he was a billionaire kingpin. Not because she wanted anything from him. But because her grandmother had taught her an ancient Buddhist chant and a simple belief, that the soul can hear what the body cannot. Sera was barely surviving herself. A Japanese-American single mother working 3 jobs to feed her little girl Hannah, carrying scars on her wrist from an abusive ex-partner who had thrown her down a staircase while she was 7 months pregnant, drowning in $12,400 of medical debt. 1 paycheck away from the street. She had every reason to keep her head down and mind her own business. But instead, she told this silent stranger about her daughter's first words. About the moon Hannah pointed at every night. About the one-eyed stuffed fox they'd found at a thrift store. And deep inside that endless gray fog of his coma, the most dangerous man in Boston was holding on to her voice like a drowning man gripping a rope, because Sera's stories about Hannah were the only points of light keeping his mind from slipping away forever. Then came the night that changed everything. When Sera had no choice but to bring her feverish, crying toddler to the hospital, and in a moment of pure desperation, laid little Hannah on the chest of a man the whole world had already declared dead. What happened over the next 8 hours wasn't medicine. It wasn't science. And no doctor could ever explain it. If this story doesn't leave you speechless, nothing will. Dex Fogarty stood in the hospital corridor, his back against the cold white wall, his eyes lowered to the sleeves that still bore the dark, dried blood of his boss, which he hadn't bothered to change since that night. It had been 3 weeks, and he could still smell gunpowder. Still hear tires screaming across wet asphalt. Still see the moment Cormac collapsed on the sidewalk outside the restaurant at Fan Pier, his eyes wide open and fixed on the harbor night sky, as if surprised that death could arrive in such an ordinary way. Dex had taken down both gunmen on the spot. 2 clean shots. But when he dropped to his knees beside Cormac, blood was already pooling beneath his boss's back, and those pale green eyes had closed. He had screamed for an ambulance, pressed both hands against the chest wound until the paramedics arrived. And from that night on, he hadn't left the hospital even once. Dex had known Cormac since they were both kids in the rough blocks of South Boston. He remembered the day Cormac was 14, standing in a cramped kitchen above a dry-cleaning shop on West Broadway, watching his father's body being brought home with 2 bullets in his chest, a gift from Alexei Sorokin, Victor's father, after the elder Riley had refused to surrender the Northern Docks territory. Cormac didn't cry that day. Didn't cry at the funeral. Didn't cry when his mother died of grief just 1 year later. Instead, he quietly turned into something the entire city feared. At 16, Cormac held his first gun. At 18, he controlled 3 city blocks. At 21, he took over the entire South Boston and Charlestown networks. Before he turned 30, he had built the Riley organization into the largest underground power on the eastern seaboard, through a combination of razor-sharp intelligence and merciless violence. But now, that empire was cracking, day by day. News of Cormac's coma spread faster than any bullet. Victor Sorokin, the man whose father had killed Cormac's father 22 years earlier, smelled blood in the water. In the first week, Sorokin seized 2 southern territories with little resistance. In the second week, 3 long-time Riley allies quietly switched sides without announcements, simply by no longer answering Dex's calls. In the third week, revenue from the underground operations dropped by more than half, and those who once bowed to the Riley name began whispering that the era was over. Dex stood outside room 2214 every day, watching the visitors. Coppos came to ask who would take power if the boss died, their eyes calculating rather than mournful. Business partners arrived to confirm rumors, then walked out with phones to their ears, calling lawyers or Sorokin. Restaurant managers came to ask who would sign the payroll checks this month. The beautiful women who once surrounded Cormac at parties vanished without a trace, as if they'd never existed. Not a single genuine tear. Not a single sincere prayer. No one came because they missed Cormac. Because they loved Cormac. Because they wanted him to live. The luxurious hospital room, with its view of the Charles River, fresh flowers replaced daily, spotless sheets, and the most advanced machines money could buy, felt colder than any morgue Dex had ever entered. At least in a morgue, someone came to cry. In this room, the room of the most powerful man in Boston, no one cried at all. Dex stood there every night, staring through the glass panel in the door, and the only thing keeping him from collapsing was the image of a small cleaning woman pushing her cart into the room each evening, pulling up a chair beside the bed and talking to his boss as if he were still there. Dex didn't understand why she did it. But he knew that in those 3 weeks, that woman was the only visitor to enter room 2214 without ambition or fear, carrying nothing but her voice and a kindness he had thought extinct long ago in their world. Finn Riley arrived at the hospital the following morning in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, hair neatly styled, face revealing no emotion at all, looking more like a chief financial officer heading into a board meeting than a brother slowly losing his younger sibling. At 41, Finn was the polished face of the Riley organization, the man who managed the upscale restaurant chain, the real estate company, and the legitimate investments the family used to clean underground money. He didn't carry a gun, didn't sit in smoke-filled backrooms negotiating territory. And for 10 years, he had told Cormac more times than he could count that violence only led to one inevitable ending. Cormac always smiled and told him to worry about the books and leave the streets to him. Now his brother lay there, and Finn hated himself because the first thing that crossed his mind wasn't grief, but who would authorize this week's transfers. Dr. Margaret Osei waited for him in a small conference room at the end of the hall, surrounded by brain scans and vital charts she knew Finn wouldn't understand but still presented because that was protocol. She spoke briefly and plainly, in the way only doctors accustomed to death can speak, saying there were no signs of recovery. The internal organs were failing faster than expected, and even if by some miracle he woke up, the brain damage would mean he'd no longer be the man Finn once knew. Finn listened, nodded once, then signed the stack of papers he'd known he would have to sign from the moment he stepped into the hospital. 72 hours after that, they would remove the ventilator. He left the conference room, walked down the corridor, nodded to Dex standing outside room 2214 as he did every day, then stepped into the elevator. He didn't go in to see Cormac. He couldn't, because if he saw his brother lying there with tubes and beeping machines, he might not be strong enough to do what had to be done next. Finn sat in the black town car in the hospital's underground garage for a long time. He didn't start the engine, didn't turn on music, didn't make any calls. He just sat there, both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight at the concrete wall ahead. He thought of Cormac at 14, standing in the kitchen, looking at their father's body without crying. And he thought of himself at 19, standing right beside him, and not crying either, because Riley brothers weren't allowed to cry. Their father had taught them that before he died. And now Finn had just signed papers for his brother to die while his eyes remained dry. And he hated himself for that more than anything he'd ever done in his life. 20 minutes later he started the engine and drove to the family's private restaurant in Fort Point where 4 coppos were already waiting around the round table behind the kitchen. The meeting was fast, cold, and practical, like every business meeting Finn had ever run. He laid out the situation. Cormac wouldn't survive. The organization needed a new head, and the transition had to happen quietly and in order before Sorokin could react. 2 coppos nodded immediately. They'd been waiting for this meeting since the previous week. One asked who would replace him and glanced at Finn with a look that mixed calculation and hope. But Dex Fogarty jumped to his feet from the corner of the room where he'd been sitting silently from the start and said his boss wasn't dead yet, that 72 hours hadn't passed, and that anyone who wanted to talk about replacing Cormac Riley while he was still breathing should say it directly to Dex first. The room fell silent for a few seconds. Finn looked at Dex and said loyalty was admirable, but reality was reality. Then continued the meeting as if Dex didn't exist. Dex walked out, drove his fist into the hallway wall until his knuckles bled, then drove back to the hospital, because he didn't know where else to go. When Dex stepped off the elevator on the private ward floor, he saw it immediately. A large funeral wreath of white chrysanthemums stood right in front of room 2214, with a small card written in elegant script offering deepest condolences from Victor Sorokin. Cormac wasn't dead. Yet Sorokin had already sent funeral flowers, not by mistake, but as a declaration. A slap in the face of the entire Riley family. A way of saying that in his eyes, Cormac was already dead and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Dex stared at the wreath for 3 seconds. Then lifted it with one hand, walked to the end of the corridor, and hurled it into a stainless steel trash bin with a crash that echoed across the floor. White chrysanthemum petals scattered across the hallway like out-of-season snow. And Dex stood there among the fallen petals, breathing hard, wondering whether he was guarding a living man or standing watch at the door of a dead one. In a cramped studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a worn-down building in Dorchester, Sera Nakamura was sitting on the kitchen floor pressing a small adhesive bandage onto Hannah's knee after the little girl tripped over a chair leg, and she realized it was the last bandage in the box. She'd have to remember to buy more, if there was anything left after paying the electricity bill. And she knew there wouldn't be, but that was something she'd deal with later, because Sera Nakamura was used to pushing everything to tomorrow until tomorrow piled up into a wall she couldn't climb. She was 27 years old, but her life already felt as long as someone who had lived 60. Her mother, Michiko Nakamura, was the only person in the world who had ever told Sera she deserved to be loved. And she died of ovarian cancer when Sera was 17, dying on the cheapest hospital bed insurance would cover, in a shared room with 3 other patients. The last thing she did was hold Sera's hand and whisper an old Nembutsu chant her own mother had taught her in Kyoto. Then tell Sera to remember that prayer, because there would come a time when she would need it more than anything else in the world. Her father, Kenji Nakamura, was a man Sera remembered only through the smell of cheap beer and the sound of a door slamming shut at midnight. He left when Sera was 9, leaving behind unpaid bills and a daughter who learned that men would leave. Always. The family in Osaka, the relatives her mother used to call every New Year, cut contact after Michiko died. Not out of cruelty, but because poverty on both sides of the Pacific didn't allow relationships that brought no practical benefit. Sera was 17. Motherless, abandoned, alone. And when Derek Walsh appeared at the diner where she washed dishes with a wide smile and warm hands that pulled her close, Sera believed fate had finally heard her prayers. Derek was 6 years older, an electrician, earning enough to rent a 1-bedroom apartment in Quincy. And for the first 6 months, he was the kindest man Sera had ever known. Then the next 6 months, he became a nightmare. It started with words, sharp, cutting remarks about her intelligence, the way she cooked, the way she laughed, the way she breathed. Then came the first slap, which Derek called an accident and cried while apologizing for 2 hours. Then came the second, without an apology. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth, until Sera stopped counting and stopped wanting to count. When Sera discovered she was pregnant, she believed the baby would change Derek, because that's what all desperate women tell themselves. But Derek didn't change. He just found more reasons to be angry. That night when Sera was 7 months pregnant, she told Derek she wanted to leave, because she was afraid for the baby, and Derek pushed her. It wasn't the hardest push he'd ever given, but she was standing at the top of the stairs, and 12 wooden steps don't require much force to destroy everything. Sera fell, her body twisting in midair, and her only instinct was to curl around her swollen belly with both arms, letting her back and wrists slam into each step instead of the baby. She lay at the bottom of the stairs in too much pain to breathe, blood soaking her clothes, her left wrist broken and swelling purple. And Derek stood at the top of the stairs, looked down at her, then walked out and closed the door. Sera lay there alone on the cold wooden floor, one hand clutching her belly, the other limp and broken at her side. And she began to recite the Buddhist chant her mother had taught her, her grandmother had taught her, repeating it again and again until a neighbor heard her moans and called an ambulance. Hannah was born 2 months early by emergency surgery at Boston Medical Center, weighing less than 2 kilograms. So small she fit into a single adult hand. Sera lay on the operating table staring at the white ceiling and asked the nurse if Derek had come. The nurse shook her head with a look of pity Sera knew all too well. Derek didn't come that day. Didn't come the next. Didn't come ever again. He vanished the way her father had vanished, leaving behind a long scar on her left wrist and a baby girl who had to lie in an incubator for 3 weeks before she was strong enough to go home. When Sera held Hannah for the first time, the baby was so small she was afraid she'd break her just by breathing. And she whispered the ancient chant to her daughter, telling her they would be all right, even though she didn't know how. From then on, every morning she woke at 4, fed Hannah, laid her in the crib, worked an early shift at the hospital, came home to feed her, worked an afternoon shift at a laundromat in Roxbury, came home to put her to sleep, then worked a night shift cleaning offices in the financial district. Not because she was brave. Sera never thought of herself as brave. She simply had no choice but to stand up, because if she lay down, Hannah would have no one. And she'd rather die than let her daughter grow up alone in the world the way she had. While Sera rose each day for her little daughter in the outside world, somewhere no one could reach, Cormac Riley was drifting. Not drifting like floating on water or drifting in a dream, but drifting in nothingness. A vast grey expanse with no up or down, no before or after, no pain yet no sensation, no fear yet no peace. Simply nothing. Cormac didn't know how long he'd been there. Didn't know who he was. Didn't know whether he was alive or dead. And most of the time he didn't care, because nothingness held a power violence never had. It rendered everything gently meaningless, so gentle you didn't even bother to resist. Sometimes sounds pierced the fog, but most were empty and cold. The voice of a woman spoke words about brain activity and brainstem function and prognosis. A voice carrying the scent of disinfectant and the professional helplessness of someone accustomed to watching patients die. The voice of a man familiar but unplaceable, spoke of transitions and timelines and decisions, words sharp as knives cutting through the mist before vanishing. The voice of another man younger, heavy with guilt and anger, said, "Boss, please wake up," said he couldn't hold everything alone, said he was sorry he hadn't been fast enough. And that voice made Cormac feel heavier, as if someone were pulling him deeper instead of hauling him up. Then there was a fourth voice. This one was different from all the others. It carried no medical terms, no strategic calculations, no guilt or regret. This voice told stories. It spoke of a little girl who learned a new word today. The word was Suki. And the child pointed at the sky and laughed. Cormac didn't know what Suki was, but the way the voice shaped the word made him feel it had to be something beautiful. It spoke of a stuffed fox missing one eye that the child hugged to sleep every night. Of the way the girl held her mother's hand on the street and pointed at everything with a tiny finger, asking, "What is that?" again and again without stopping. Sometimes the voice spoke of sad things, of exhaustion, of fear, of long sleepless nights. But even in sadness, the voice carried something Cormac couldn't find in any other sound. Warmth. Real warmth. Not the warmth of flattery or obligatory loyalty or conditional affection, but the warmth of someone speaking to him for no reason other than believing he deserved to hear a kind voice. Cormac didn't know who the voice belonged to. Didn't know what she looked like. Didn't know what she was to him. But whenever it appeared, the grey fog seemed to thin just a little. And whenever it faded, the darkness grew heavier, and Cormac drifted farther away. That voice was the only thread Cormac still held. And he clung to it with the deepest instinct he had left. The instinct that even a coma couldn't erase. The instinct of someone about to drown, who knows that if he lets go, there won't ever be a second chance. That evening, Sera came to the hospital for her shift as she did every night, pushing her cleaning cart down the corridor of the private ward. And before she could turn toward room 2214, Nurse Agnes stepped out from the nurse's station and stopped her. Agnes was a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair, who always carried peppermint candies in her pocket and sometimes quietly slipped Sera a carton of milk from the staff cafeteria without saying a word. The kind of silent kindness that comes from working in a hospital long enough to understand that sometimes a free carton of milk matters more than any comfort speech. But tonight Agnes carried no peppermint candies and no milk. She carried bad news. She drew Sera aside into a corner of the hallway and told her as gently as she could that the family had decided, in 72 hours, they would remove the breathing tube from the patient in room 2214. And Agnes thought Sera should know, because she'd seen her talk to the patient every night for the past 3 weeks. Sera stood there with her hands still resting on the handle of the cleaning cart, and she cried. Not sobbing, not making any sound, just tears running down both cheeks that she didn't bother to wipe away. And she didn't understand why she was crying. She didn't know the man's real name until the second week when she read it on the chart at the foot of the bed. Didn't know what he did, where he lived, whether he had any real family or friends. She only knew that for 3 weeks she told him everything she never told anyone else. About Hannah, about fear, about long nights, about the small, fragile hope she hid in her chest as if speaking it aloud would make it disappear. And now the only person in the world who knew all of that was about to be gone. Sera wiped her eyes with her sleeve and asked Agnes if she could go into the room one last time. Just for a few minutes. Agnes nodded and turned away so Sera wouldn't feel ashamed of her tears. Sera stepped into room 2214, left the cleaning cart in the hallway, and for the first time, she didn't clean, didn't wipe surfaces, didn't change the trash bag. She simply pulled the white plastic chair close to the bed and sat down. The room looked the same as every night. The steady beeping of machines, the soft lighting, the scent of disinfectant mixed with clean laundry. The 2 guards outside the door paid no attention to her. They were used to the small cleaning woman pushing her cart into the room every night and quietly pushing it back out. Sera studied Cormac's face, really studied it for the first time. He was 36, but he had the lines around his eyes of a man in his 50s. On his left cheek, there was a faint scar about 2 finger lengths long. On his neck, another scar, smaller and rounder, that she didn't want to guess the origin of. But beneath those scars, beneath the harsh angles of his jaw and brows, Sera saw a tired face, tired down to the bone. The kind of exhaustion that didn't come from 3 weeks in a coma, but from a lifetime without rest. The kind of exhaustion she saw every morning in the mirror when she looked at herself. And she thought that maybe before lying in this hospital bed, this man had never truly lived either. That he had only been surviving, day by day, just like her. Only he survived in a penthouse on Beacon Hill, and she survived in a studio in Dorchester. But loneliness didn't care about zip codes. Sera leaned closer and began to speak. Her voice a whisper meant only for herself to hear. She said she was sorry. Sorry that no one could save him. Sorry that this world treated people as if they only mattered while they were still useful. She told him about the invisible thread, the thing her grandmother had taught her mother, and her mother had taught her. That every soul in the world is connected by threads the eye can't see. And when one person gently pulls a thread, somewhere else another person will feel it. And she said she'd been pulling this thread for 3 weeks now. And she didn't know if he could feel it. But she hoped he could. Then Sera placed her hand on Cormac's forehead, closed her eyes, and whispered the ancient Nembutsu chant passed down from her grandmother to her mother, and from her mother to her. Ancient syllables flowing softly through the quiet room as if they belonged there, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment through generations to be spoken. She held Cormac's hand one last time, her rough, cracked hand wrapping around his larger, warmer one, and held it for a long time before letting go. Standing up, pushing the chair back where it belonged, and walking out of the room without looking back, because she knew that if she did, she wouldn't have the strength to leave. Sera opened the door to the studio apartment in Dorchester just before midnight. Flipped on the fluorescent light. The bulb flickered 3 times before finally staying on, casting a pale white glare that made everything in the room look worse than it really was, even though reality was bad enough already. She set her keys on the particle board table by the door, kicked off her worn sneakers, and stepped into the kitchen to open the refrigerator. Inside, half a carton of milk close to expiring, a piece of tofu wrapped in foil, 2 eggs, and a pitcher of filtered water. She closed the fridge gently, as if shutting it harder might make the few things inside vanish. By the bed, Hannah was sitting on the floor amid a pile of pillows and blankets, clutching the one-eyed stuffed fox in her arms, her big round eyes watching her mother come in. Mrs. Kim had gone back to her own place at the end of the hallway around 9 after feeding Hannah dinner of white rice and scrambled egg. And since then, Hannah had waited alone in the locked apartment without crying, because she was used to it. Not yet 2 years old, and already accustomed to waiting, to her mother always leaving and always coming back. And knowing that her mother would return was enough. Sera sat down on the floor beside her, and Hannah tilted her head and looked at her with eyes too old for her age and asked, "Mama sad?" in a tiny, clear voice. Sera tried to smile and said no, Mama was just tired. But her eyes were still red from leaving room 2214. And she knew she wasn't fooling anyone, not even a child not yet 2. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Sera pulled it out and felt the blood in her veins turn cold. Derek Walsh. 2 years without a sign. 2 years of slowly starting to believe he was truly gone. And now his name appeared on the cracked screen of her phone like a ghost from a nightmare she thought she'd woken up from. The message was short, cold, and calculated down to every word. He said he'd spoken to a lawyer, that he would file for custody because he'd heard she left the child alone at night to go to work, and that was grounds for the court to reconsider. And that if she wanted to resolve it quietly, she should call him back. Sera knew Derek had a domestic violence record. Knew that with that record, almost no court in Massachusetts would grant him custody. Knew this was nothing more than cheap extortion by a coward. But she also knew something else, that Derek knew better than anyone. To respond to a lawsuit, she needed a lawyer. And family lawyers in Boston charged between $300 and $500 an hour. Even if she won, legal fees would still land somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 that she didn't have, had never had, and had no idea when she ever would. Derek didn't want Hannah. He'd never wanted Hannah. He wanted money, or power, or to see Sera afraid. Or all three at once. And the worst part was that it was working. Sera sat on the floor staring at the message until the letters blurred with tears. Then deleted it with trembling fingers, as if erasing it would make it not real. Set the phone face down on the floor and pulled Hannah into her arms and held her tight. The child didn't understand what was happening, but the instincts of a child raised in instability made Hannah fall silent and hug her mother back with both small arms, one hand still gripping the ear of the one-eyed stuffed fox. Sera cried without sound, the kind of crying she'd mastered after years of practice. Shoulders shaking, breath breaking, but not a single noise escaping, because she didn't want Hannah to hear. And as she sat there on the cold studio floor with her daughter in her arms, she thought of the $12,400 in hospital debt from 2 months earlier, when Hannah was admitted with pneumonia at Boston Medical Center. 3 nights in the pediatric emergency unit, 4 fluids, antibiotics, chest x-rays, and when the bill arrived, Sera had nearly fainted. Medicaid had denied a large portion due to a paperwork error, a single box she'd forgotten to check on the renewal form. A small, stupid mistake she hadn't had time to catch. Because that day she'd been running between 3 jobs, feeding Hannah on a bus. And now that mistake had become $12,400 in debt, with a collections agency calling every week in the same polite, robotic voice. Hannah started coughing at 2 in the morning. A dry, rasping sound like stones grinding together inside her tiny chest. And by 3, her little body was burning so hot that Sera pressed a hand to her forehead and flinched away. Sera didn't have a thermometer. The old one had run out of batteries the month before and she hadn't been able to buy a new one. But she didn't need a thermometer to know this fever was worse than the others. Hannah lay on the bed with her eyes tightly shut, cheeks flushed, sweat soaking her thin hair, occasionally letting out a soft moan before another coughing fit seized her and curled her small body inward. Sera ran to the kitchen, turned on the cold tap, soaked a cloth, ran back to lay it on her daughter's forehead, flipped it, soaked it again, laid it back down. Repeating the cycle from 3 to 4 in the morning in the silent apartment, broken only by her child's coughing and the drip of water from the wet cloth. She gave Hannah half the last dose of children's fever medicine left in the bottle, tipping it carefully to catch every drop, then sat against the wall holding her and waiting for it to work. By 4, the fever eased slightly. But the coughing didn't stop. It was Sunday. Mrs. Kim had said the day before that she was going to her daughter's place in Cambridge and wouldn't be back until late evening. No Mrs. Kim meant no one to watch Hannah. Sera had no close friends in this building, no family in this city, no one in the world except the kind Korean neighbor who had gone to Cambridge. The free clinic on Bowden Street, where Sera usually took Hannah whenever she was sick, was closed on Sundays. Taking her to the emergency room meant another bill she couldn't afford, piled on top of the $12,400 already crushing her. Sera's phone buzzed at 4:15. The hospital shift supervisor, her voice tired and pleading, said the flu had knocked out 3 more members of the night cleaning crew and they were desperately short-staffed, asking if Sera could take the Sunday shift from 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning. Sera said she couldn't. Her child was sick. The supervisor was silent for a second, then said the 2 words she knew Sera couldn't refuse. Double pay. Sera closed her eyes. Double pay for a 12-hour shift meant enough to cover this month's rent, which the landlord had already reminded her about twice. It meant enough to buy fever medicine and antibiotics if Hannah needed them. It meant keeping a roof over their heads for another 30 days before the next crisis. She opened her eyes and looked at Hannah sleeping on the bed, cheeks still red, one hand gripping the ear of the one-eyed stuffed fox, her breathing heavy but steadier now that the medicine had taken hold. She told the supervisor she'd come in. Then she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, watching her daughter sleep, hating herself for the decision, but knowing it wasn't really a decision at all. It was surrender to the kind of arithmetic poor people are forced to solve every day. Equations where every answer is wrong, and you can only choose the one that's the least wrong. At 5 in the evening, Sera bathed Hannah in warm water, dressed her in the cleanest pajamas she had, gave her a little cough syrup she found in the back of the cabinet. 2 months past expiration, but better than nothing. She wrapped Hannah in the thickest blanket they owned, tucked the one-eyed stuffed fox into her hand, pulled a knit hat down over her head, and lifted her onto her shoulder. Hannah didn't cry. She just rested her head against her mother's neck and breathed hot through her shirt. And Sera left the studio apartment, locked the door, walked down 3 flights of stairs, because the elevator had been broken since the week before, stepped out onto the street, caught a bus in the February cold cutting into their faces, and headed toward Massachusetts General Hospital with her sick child in her arms and nothing else in her coat pocket but her apartment key and her employee badge. Sera arrived at the hospital at 6 in the evening, carrying Hannah in her arms and entering through the employee door at the back of the building to avoid being seen. The first thing she did was go to the staff break room in the basement, a small room with 2 green vinyl benches, an old wooden table, a microwave, and a pot of coffee someone had brewed on the previous shift and forgotten to throw out. She spread the blanket she'd brought over the bench against the wall, gently laid Hannah down, propped her head on a folded jacket as a pillow, tucked the one-eyed stuffed fox into her arms, then stepped back and looked at her. Hannah lay curled on the bench, so small that more than half of it was still empty, her cheeks flushed with fever, her breathing still heavy, but she'd fallen asleep on the bus and hadn't woken. Sera took a deep breath and went upstairs to clock in. And from that moment, the battle between the mother and the janitor began. She cleaned rooms on the 3rd floor, every 15 minutes setting the mop aside and running down to the basement to check on Hannah, then running back up to continue. She cleaned rooms on the 5th floor, 15 minutes down, 15 minutes up, her legs aching from the stairs, but she didn't dare take the elevator for fear of running into a supervisor and having to explain why she was breathless and sweating through her clothes in the middle of winter. Every time she opened the break room door, she held her breath until she saw Hannah still lying there, still breathing, still clutching the stuffed fox. And every time she had to fight the instinct to scoop her up and run home. By 9 in the evening, Hannah woke and began to fuss. The fever spiked again, her little face burning hot, her eyes glassy and unfocused, and she started calling Mama in a fragile voice, repeating it like a prayer where the only word she knew was her mother's name. Sera rushed down and gathered her up, wiped her face and hands and feet with a damp cloth, gave her warm water from a bottle, and sat there rocking her until Hannah drifted back to sleep. Then laid her down again and ran back upstairs to keep cleaning. Another night janitor passed the break room and saw Hannah, but said nothing. only looked at Sera with the knowing gaze of someone from the same life and kept walking. Because everyone on the night cleaning crew carried a similar story. Everyone had a child at home or a sick relative they had to set aside to come to work, and no one had the heart to judge. At 11 at night, Sera looked at the room assignment list and saw room 2214. She stood staring at that number for a long time, remembering that tomorrow night, when the 72 hours were over, that room would be empty. The sheets changed, the machines removed, and the man she'd talked to for 3 weeks would no longer be there. This was the last time she would clean that room while he was still breathing. She looked down the stairwell toward the basement, thought of Hannah lying alone down there with a fever and her stuffed fox, and decided she couldn't leave her alone any longer. Not one more minute. Losing her job didn't matter. Getting fired didn't matter. She wasn't going to leave her daughter lying alone in a cold hospital basement break room while she mopped floors. Sera ran downstairs, lifted Hannah up, the child burning hot and limp against her shoulder, then carried her up to the private ward, pushing the cleaning cart with one hand and holding her child with the other. When she reached room 2214, the 2 night guards looked at her and then at the child on her shoulder. She'd cleaned this room every night for 3 weeks. They knew her face, knew she was harmless. The older guard glanced at the sleeping child and shifted aside just enough to let her pass without saying a word. Sera stepped into room 2214 for the last time. The room was the same as every night, the steady beeping of the machines counting down the time Cormac Riley had left. The soft amber light. The stillness so deep she could hear Hannah's heavy breathing against her shoulder, blending with the monitor's rhythm like 2 mismatched melodies accidentally playing the same song. Sera began cleaning the room with one hand, the other holding Hannah against her hip. She was used to doing everything one-handed since Hannah was born. But Hannah was the problem, because the fever made the child restless and uncomfortable, and she refused to stay still anywhere. Sera tried setting Hannah on the plastic chair in the room, but the child cried the moment her back touched the cold surface, cried louder when Sera placed her on the visitor sofa, and screamed when Sera tried padding the floor with a blanket. The dry, rasping cry of a feverish child tearing through the quiet room, sending panic through Sera because she knew if the guards outside heard it, she'd be in trouble. And if a supervisor found out she'd brought a sick toddler into a patient's room, she'd be fired on the spot. Sera stood in the middle of the room with Hannah crying in her arms, sweat running down her temples, scanning desperately for anywhere at all, warm enough and soft enough for Hannah to settle. And her eyes landed on Cormac. He lay there on the hospital bed, his chest rising and falling steadily with the ventilator, his large body warm beneath the white sheets. And Sera knew this was the most reckless thought she'd ever had. But she had no other choice. She whispered an apology and gently placed Hannah on Cormac's chest, just to rest her arms for 1 minute. Just 1 minute while she wiped the table. And she'd pick her up right away. Hannah touched Cormac's chest and stopped crying. Not slowly calming, but stopping instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. The cry cut off mid-sound and replaced by silence. The child lay there for a second, then another, then slowly curled inward like a kitten finding warmth, pressing her fever-hot cheek against Cormac's chest just above his heart. Her tiny hands clutched the fabric of his hospital gown. And for the first time all day, Hannah slept. Truly slept. Her breathing slowing and evening out. Her face easing out of pain, as if the chest of this coma-bound man was the safest place she'd ever known. Sera stood frozen, afraid to breathe. She waited 10 seconds. 20. Then bent to lift Hannah. And the moment her hand touched the child, Hannah screamed again, instantly and reflexively, and Sera hurriedly placed her back on Cormac's chest. The child fell silent, curling up, gripping the gown, sleeping on. She tried a 3rd time, lifted her, cried, set her down, silence. A 4th time, lifted her, cried, set her down, silence. She didn't dare try a 5th. Sera pulled a chair beside the bed, her eyes never leaving Hannah sleeping on Cormac's chest, guarding the scene like a miracle she didn't understand and didn't dare believe. When she was sure Hannah was deeply asleep and safe, she began to tell stories as she did every night, her voice a whisper just loud enough to hear herself, telling them to both of them. to the child sleeping on the chest, and to the man sinking in darkness beneath. She said today had been the worst day in a long line of bad days. She spoke of Hannah's fever, of the night bus in the cold, of the helplessness of not being able to protect a child from things as simple as illness and poverty. Then she spoke of the moon Hannah pointed to every night on the walk home, of how the child said Suki clearly and proudly, as if it were the most important word in the world. And she said that maybe for Hannah it truly was. Because the moon was always there. Every night it was there. It never left. 1 hour passed, then 2. And Sera stayed there, telling stories, and she didn't notice right away. But something in the room was changing. The beeping of the heart monitor began to shift. No longer the flat, steady rhythm of every other night, but a little faster, just a little, then slowing, then quickening again. As if the heart were trying to remember how to beat on its own rather than on the machine's command. Sera looked up at the monitor. At first, thinking her eyes were blurring from exhaustion. But no, the heart rate line was rippling differently. And the blood pressure numbers were inching upward. Deep within the endless grey fog, Cormac felt something he hadn't felt in 3 weeks. Something rested on his chest. Light, barely there, yet warm. Truly warm. Not the vague warmth of memory or hallucination, but warmth with weight, with rhythm, with breath. A tiny heartbeat fluttered against him, twice as fast as his own. Quick and fragile, like a butterfly's wings inside his chest. And Cormac sensed it through every layer of coma and nothingness. Then came the smell. Warm milk and baby powder and child sweat. A scent he'd never known, because he'd never been close to a child long enough to learn what they smelled like. Yet the deepest instinct in him recognized it instantly. Then came the hand. A tiny hand gripping his gown with the weak yet determined grasp of a sleeping child. And that grasp pulled Cormac toward the light more powerfully than any drug or medical technology ever invented. For the first time in 3 weeks, Cormac didn't just hear but felt. Didn't just drift but clung. Didn't just exist in nothingness but wanted to leave it. The familiar voice was still there, speaking of the moon, drawing him closer, but it was the warmth on his chest that forced him to choose between letting go and holding on. At 4 in the morning, the index finger of Cormac Riley's right hand twitched. A small movement, too slight to notice, unless someone was watching closely. But Sera was holding his hand, and she felt it. She stopped breathing, her heart racing, her eyes locked on his hand, waiting. And the finger moved again. Then the whole hand gently closed around her finger. Sera pressed the call button with her free hand, the other refusing to let go. And then Cormac opened his eyes. Cormac Riley's eyes opened for the first time in 3 weeks. The world he saw wasn't a white ceiling or harsh hospital lights, but a blurred, shapeless chaos, like looking through murky water. Everything bleeding together into meaningless streaks of light and shadow. He didn't know where he was, didn't know who he was, didn't know how much time had passed. His body felt heavy as lead, every finger movement demanding an effort he wasn't sure he possessed. But he felt 2 things more clearly than any image before his eyes. The warmth on his chest, and the voice beside him. His vision slowly focused, and the first thing Cormac saw clearly was a thin crown of dark hair just beneath his chin, a tiny head resting on his chest, a small hand no bigger than half his palm gripping the edge of his hospital gown. A child. The child from the stories the voice had told him every night. Cormac didn't know her name. Didn't know what she looked like until this moment. But he knew this was the child who loved the moon. The child who slept clutching a one-eyed stuffed fox. The child that voice loved more than anything in the world. And somehow that child was lying on his chest, and her light breathing was the thread that had pulled him back from nothingness. Cormac shifted his eyes to the side and saw her. The woman sitting on the white plastic chair beside the bed. Thin, dark hair hastily tied back, brown eyes swollen and red, tears streaming down her cheeks she didn't bother to wipe away. Just staring at him in disbelief. The owner of the voice. Cormac tried to speak, but his throat was dry and rigid after 3 weeks of disuse, and his lips only moved without sound. Sera hit the nurse call button again. this time over and over. And in less than a minute, the quiet room turned into a storm. The on-duty nurse rushed in, saw Cormac's open eyes, froze for a second in disbelief, then spun around and ran into the hallway shouting for the attending doctor. Another nurse rushed in, then two, then three. The lights flared bright. Someone rolled in a cart of equipment. Someone checked the monitors. Someone called Dr. Osei at home at 4 in the morning with a trembling voice saying, "Doctor, the patient in room 2214 is awake." Yes, truly awake. Eyes open and responsive. In the chaos, one nurse noticed Hannah lying on Cormac's chest and stepped forward to lift the child away, because this was a serious violation, an unidentified child on an intensive care patient's bed. And as her hand slid under Hannah, Cormac's hand rose. Slow, shaking, weak to the point of barely having strength, but deliberate and clear. His hand settled on Hannah's back, shielding her, holding her there. And his cloudy pale green eyes fixed on the nurse with a look that, even from a hospital bed after 3 weeks in a coma, made her stop and step back. It was Cormac Riley's first conscious movement in 3 weeks. And he used it not to touch his own face, not to reach for the call button, not to do anything for himself, but to keep a child he had never met lying safely on his chest. Hannah didn't wake. She slept through the chaos, through the running footsteps and urgent voices and blazing lights, still curled on Cormac's chest with her hand clutching his gown. And his hand, 4 times the size of hers, rested on her back like a promise he wasn't yet awake enough to understand he was making. The 2 guards outside heard the commotion and burst in, saw their boss's eyes open. The older one immediately stepped back into the hallway and pulled out his phone to call Dex Fogarty. Dex was sitting in his car in the hospital parking garage, where he'd slept every night for 3 weeks, because he didn't want to be more than a 5-minute walk from his boss. When the phone rang at 4:12 in the morning, he answered on the first ring. He heard 3 words, and the phone slipped from his hand. Dex sat there staring into the darkness, his entire body shaking uncontrollably, the kind of shaking that comes when someone has held everything in for weeks and the body finally betrays him by releasing it all at once. He picked up the phone, dialed Finn with fingers shaking so badly he had to try 3 times. When Finn answered with the irritated, half-asleep voice of a man woken at 4 in the morning, Dex managed to say only one sentence. "He's awake." There was silence on the line. A long silence, long enough that Dex thought the call had dropped. Then Finn spoke in a voice Dex had never heard from him before. A voice breaking at the edges of each word, like water spilling through a cracked dam. "I'm coming now." Before dawn fully broke, news that Cormac Riley had awakened from his coma spread through the Boston underworld faster than any bullet he'd ever fired. From bars in Southie to nightclubs in the Seaport, from warehouses in East Boston to penthouse offices on the Back Bay, phones rang and messages flew. Reactions split cleanly in 2, those who'd stayed loyal breathed in relief, and those who'd switched sides began to sweat cold. At his compound on the North Shore, Victor Sorokin was sitting in his oak-paneled study drinking vodka at 5 in the morning when his capo knocked and entered with a pale face and said, "Riley is awake." Sorokin said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he tightened his grip on the glass and squeezed until it shattered, vodka and blood mixing among the shards on the wooden desk. He looked down at his bleeding hand without any change in expression, because Victor Sorokin had just understood that the man he declared dead with a wreath of white chrysanthemums wasn't dead at all. And when Cormac Riley returned, the first thing he would remember would be that wreath. In the days that followed, Cormac Riley recovered in a way Dr. Osei called something she had never seen in any medical textbook she'd ever read. Brain function returned almost completely. Cognitive abilities came back piece by piece, memory intact, language intact, motor function weak but improving daily. She couldn't explain it with any scientific theory beyond a shrug and the admission that sometimes the human body does things medicine hasn't caught up with yet. The physical recovery was brutal. 3 weeks of immobility had wasted his muscles. Every attempt to sit up felt like being shot with 3 bullets all over again. But he endured it without complaint, because Cormac Riley had been stabbed, beaten, starved, and hurt enough times in real life to know that pain is just a signal from the body, and signals can be ignored. What he couldn't ignore was the memory of that night. Blurred but certain. The warmth on his chest. The tiny heartbeat. The smell of warm milk. And the face of the woman crying beside his bed when he opened his eyes. On the third day after waking, when Cormac was strong enough to sit propped against pillows and speak without losing his breath, he called Dex into the room and asked in a hoarse but steady voice who the woman from that night was. Dex had been waiting for the question. He handed Cormac a thin file, the result of an investigation he'd ordered the very morning Cormac woke. Because Dex knew his boss. And he knew the first thing Cormac would ask wouldn't be about the organization, wouldn't be about Sorokin, wouldn't be about territory or money, but about her. Sera Nakamura. 27 years old. Born in Dorchester. Japanese-American. Single mother. One daughter named Hannah, nearly 2 years old. Hospital janitor, evening and night shifts. Additional work at a laundromat in Roxbury and office cleaning for a company in the financial district. Lives in a third-floor studio apartment on a building in Dorchester. No criminal record, no civil cases, no ties to any criminal organizations, no gambling debt, no drug involvement. Completely clean. So clean that Dex had the check run twice, because in their world, no one that clean just happened to appear beside a boss's hospital bed. But she really was clean. Really was a coincidence. Really was just a janitor pushing a cart into the room every night and talking to a coma patient out of pure kindness. No motive at all. She didn't know who his boss was. Cormac finished the file, folded it, set it on his stomach, and said simply, "Bring her here." Dex nodded and left. And 2 hours later, Sera Nakamura stood at the door of room 2214 in her light blue janitor uniform. Hair pulled into a ponytail, eyes lowered, hands clasped tightly in front of her stomach. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her. Cormac was visibly thinner after 3 weeks, cheekbones sharper, eye sockets deeper. But those pale green eyes were alive. Alive in a way that made Sera swallow and want to take a step back. They weren't the eyes of a fragile patient who had narrowly escaped death. They were the cold, sharp eyes of a man who had seen enough of the world to be surprised by nothing. And they were fixed on her without blinking, as if reading every page of her life. The room was silent except for the monitor. Cormac studied her for a long time. Sera met his gaze. And neither of them spoke for so long that the air grew heavy. Then Cormac spoke, his voice still rough and slow, but each word clear. "You talk to me every night." Why? Not a question. A demand for explanation. The tone of a man used to giving orders rather than asking. Sera looked at him and answered more softly than she intended, because her throat tightened. "Because no one else did. Every night I came in here to clean, and you were lying there alone. No one talked to you. No one held your hand. And my grandmother taught me that the soul can hear what the body can't. So I talked to you because I thought maybe you needed to hear a voice that wasn't asking anything from you." Cormac didn't react right away. He kept looking at her for a few more seconds. Then said the thing Sera wasn't prepared to hear. "I heard you. All of it. I heard about your daughter learning the word Suki. I heard about the one-eyed stuffed fox. I heard you talk about the worst night and the cold bus ride. I heard the chant you whispered on my forehead. I heard everything. And your voice was the only thing that kept me from drifting away." Sera stood there as tears spilled down her face before she could stop them, fast and heavy, as if a valve had been opened that she couldn't find a way to close. And she cried not from sadness, but because for the first time in her life, someone told her that her voice had value. That the small kindness she gave every night while the world wasn't looking had truly reached someone. That she wasn't invisible. Cormac watched her cry and said nothing more, offered no comfort, no thanks, because he didn't know how to do those things. But he didn't look away either. And for a man who had spent his entire life turning away from every emotion, the act of continuing to look at a woman crying in front of him without retreating was more than anyone had ever received from him. Outside the room, Dex Fogarty leaned against the wall, his right hand resting on the gun at his back out of reflex, his eyes watching through the small window in the door. He saw his boss, the man he'd followed since childhood, the man he'd seen capable of terrible things, looking at a janitor woman crying with eyes Dex had never seen on him before. Not calculating eyes. Not cold eyes. Not pitying or indifferent eyes. Soft eyes. Dex Fogarty had walked beside Cormac Riley for 20 years. And he had never, not once, seen those pale green eyes soften. And now they had softened for a thin woman in a janitor's uniform standing and crying in a hospital room. After Sera left the hospital room that day, Cormac lay in silence for a long time, staring up at the ceiling. Then he called Dex in and said in a voice that left no room for questions that he wanted to know everything about her. Not a summary. He wanted everything. 2 days later, Dex returned with a file 3 times thicker than before. Cormac read every page from his hospital bed. And with each page he turned, his jaw tightened a little more. The first page detailed Derek Walsh. The police report from the night Sera fell down the stairs. The second page showed threatening messages about filing for custody, the cold, calculated language of a man who didn't want a child but wanted to use a child as leverage for extortion. The third page listed the $12,400 in hospital debt from Hannah's pneumonia admission. The fourth page showed that the combined wages from 3 jobs still weren't enough for Sera to cover rent, food, medication, and debt at the same time. That she was 2 months behind on rent. Cormac finished the last page, folded the file, set it on the table beside his bed, and sat in silence for a long time. Dex had seen his boss angry many times over 20 years. Angry when territory was violated. Angry when betrayed. Angry when plans failed. But those angers were cold, controlled tools used to reach an outcome. The anger on Cormac's face now was different. It wasn't cold. It was hot. Hot in a raw, primitive way Dex had seen only once before, when Cormac was 14, standing over his father's body. It was the anger of a man who wanted to protect someone and couldn't accept that she'd been hurt while he wasn't there. Cormac gave Dex 3 instructions in order. His voice calm, but every word carrying the weight of an unchangeable command. First, call the family's lawyers and have them pay off all of Sera Nakamura's medical debt anonymously, without letting her know where the money came from, routing it through a charitable foundation or a medical assistance program so it looked legitimate. Dex nodded. Second, find Derek Walsh and talk to him. Not kill him, because a body creates investigations, and investigations create questions. Just talk clearly enough that Derek would understand that if he contacted Sera or Hannah even one more time, even by a single message, he'd wish he'd never been born. Dex nodded again. And this time he almost smiled, because this was the kind of work he did best. Third, if anyone or anything threatened Sera Nakamura or her daughter from this moment forward, Dex was to handle it the same way he'd handle a direct threat to Cormac himself. Dex looked at his boss for 3 seconds. Then said he understood. 3 days later, Sera opened the mailbox in her apartment lobby and found an envelope from the collections agency. Inside wasn't a payment demand. It was a notice stating that the entire $12,400 balance had been paid in full through a community medical assistance program, and her account was closed with a 0 balance. Sera read the letter twice. 3 times. Then flipped it over as if the explanation had to be on the back. But there was nothing else. She didn't know which program it was, didn't remember applying for any assistance. But she didn't question it too deeply, because when you're poor to the point of desperation, you accept miracles first and ask questions later. That same week in Quincy, Derek Walsh was drinking beer in his filthy apartment when there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Dex Fogarty standing there, not alone, but with 2 other men. And Dex didn't say much, because he never did. He handed Derek a phone on speaker. And Cormac Riley's voice came through the line, slow and clear, saying exactly once what would happen if Derek ever touched Sera's or Hannah's life again. No one knows exactly what Cormac said, but the outcome was clear. Derek Walsh withdrew his custody petition the next day, deleted Sera's number, erased every means of contact, and left Quincy within a week without telling anyone where he was going. Sera never received another message from Derek. And she didn't understand why. But she didn't complain. She only let out a breath she'd been holding for 2 years, and held Hannah a little tighter that night. But the wall hadn't fallen completely. 1 week after Cormac woke, Sera was summoned to the hospital administration office. 2 managers sat behind a desk with stern faces and a file in front of them, saying security cameras had recorded Sera bringing a small child into an intensive care patient's room on the night Cormac woke, that it was a serious violation of safety and sanitation policy, and they had no choice but to terminate her employment. Sera sat there listening. She didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't explain, because she was too tired to beg anyone for anything anymore. She only nodded and prepared to stand and leave. When the phone on the desk rang, one manager answered, listened for 30 seconds, his face draining from stern to pale, then set the phone down and looked at his colleague with the expression of someone who had just realized he was standing in a minefield. The call was from the hospital's legal department. The message was simple. The Riley family had donated more than $2 million to Massachusetts General Hospital over the past 3 years. And the family's legal representative had just called to say that if an employee named Sera Nakamura was affected in any way related to her job, the family would reconsider all future funding commitments. The 2 managers looked at each other, then at Sera. The older one spoke in a completely different tone than a minute earlier, saying perhaps they'd been a bit hasty, that they would review her case, and that Sera could return to work as usual. Sera left the administration office without understanding what had just happened. Without knowing why the storm had suddenly stopped. Without knowing that a hand was moving in the shadows behind her life, quietly and methodically removing every threat. The hand of the man she'd spoken to every night when he couldn't answer, and who was now answering in the only way he knew how. Cormac Riley was discharged from the hospital on a Tuesday morning, stepping into the black SUV waiting at the entrance with decks opening the door and 2 escort vehicles positioned front and back. And the Boston underworld understood that the wolf had returned. In the first week, Cormac summoned each capo one by one to his penthouse on Beacon Hill. Not for a group meeting, but individually, because Cormac knew fear worked best when it was personal. Those who had remained loyal throughout the 3 weeks kept their positions and were generously rewarded. Those who had wavered were given a single chance to prove loyalty by returning everything they had taken while Cormac was in the hospital. As for the 3 allies who had switched sides to Sorokin, they received a call from Dex. And after that call, no one ever saw them appear at any negotiating table in the city again. Cormac reclaimed each territory methodically and with far greater ruthlessness than before he was shot. Because before the shooting he had been ruthless simply because it was the only way he knew. But now he was ruthless because he had something to protect, and anyone who threatened that needed to understand the cost. Yet between closed-door meetings thick with smoke, between midnight calls where his voice remained cold as he issued orders, between moments when Cormac Riley was exactly the monster the underworld feared, he found himself thinking about Sera's voice. Not deliberately, but her voice surfaced unexpectedly. Her voice talking about Hannah pointing at the moon. About the one-eyed stuffed fox. About the way she'd said, "I thought maybe you needed to hear a voice that didn't ask anything from you." And every time that voice cut in, Cormac needed a few seconds to pull himself back into the room full of men waiting for his command. The truth came looking for Sera on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after their meeting in the hospital cafe. In the basement staff break room where she was sitting with half a sandwich from home while waiting for her evening shift to start. The old television mounted on the wall was always tuned to the local news no one watched. But that night Sera looked up because she heard a familiar name. On the screen was a breaking news segment. The reporter standing in front of the federal courthouse on Fan Pier, with a ticker running below that read, "Cormac Riley, notorious Boston mob boss miraculously awakens from 3-week coma." Then his image appeared. Not a hospital photo but an older one. Cormac in a black coat, stepping out of the courthouse with cold pale green eyes staring straight into the camera, his face empty of expression. Dex Fogarty visible behind him. While the reporter talked about the Riley criminal organization, about extortion and money laundering allegations that had never quite been enough to prosecute, about the assassination attempt outside a South Boston restaurant, about how his mysterious awakening had shocked both law enforcement and the underworld, the half sandwich slipped from Sera's hand. And she didn't pick it up. She sat there staring at the screen without blinking as the reporter continued listing what Cormac Riley was accused of having done. The people hurt. The businesses squeezed. The neighborhoods living in fear under his family's control. And each word landed like a punch to Sera's chest. Because she realized that the man she'd spoken to every night, the man she'd prayed for, the man she'd cried over when she thought he was dying, the man her daughter had slept on, wasn't some unlucky anonymous patient, but one of the most dangerous men in the city. Shock came first. Then fear. Then anger, hot and sharp, replacing fear, because Sera felt deceived. Felt her kindness had been used, even if she didn't yet understand how. Felt she'd opened herself and poured out her deepest secrets and pain to someone she hadn't known at all. And that he'd sat across from her in the hospital cafe without saying a word about the truth. Sera didn't wait. She called the number Cormac had left when he offered her the position. 2 hours later they were sitting across from each other in the hospital cafe, the same table as before. But this time Sera wasn't polite and she wasn't gentle. She looked straight into his eyes and said she'd seen the news. That she knew who he was now. That she didn't want any connection to his world, not even a single strand. That her daughter was everything she had in this world, and she wouldn't let Hannah be put in danger for anyone. And she told him to forget her. Forget Hannah. Forget the voice from those nights. Because Sera Nakamura didn't belong in Cormac Riley's world. Cormac listened without interrupting, without frowning, without turning cold. And when Sera finished, the cafe sat in heavy silence between them. Then Cormac spoke. And it wasn't the voice of a boss issuing orders, but a voice Sera had never heard before. A voice fractured at the edges of every word. The voice of a man saying something he'd never said to anyone, and likely never would again. He told her she was the only person who'd spoken to him while he lay there. Not because of who he was, because she hadn't known who he was. That she spoke to him because of who she was. Because she believed the soul could hear what the body couldn't. Because she told moon stories to a dying stranger. Because where the rest of the world saw only power or a threat, she saw a lonely man who'd never truly lived. That in 36 years, no one had ever looked at him that way. Not a single person. That she was the only one. And that he was asking her not to take that away. Cormac said nothing more. He placed money for the coffee on the table even though neither of them had drunk anything. Then stood and left with Dex following. And Sera stayed behind alone in the hospital cafe, staring at the empty chair across from her. She left 10 minutes later and went to clean rooms on the evening shift like every other day. And she didn't call Cormac that night, or the next day, or the day after that. But his words wouldn't leave her. They followed her onto the bus back to Dorchester, followed her into the studio apartment, followed her into bed where she lay beside Hannah sleeping with the one-eyed stuffed fox in her arms. You are the only one. Sera closed her eyes and saw those pale green eyes. Not the cold eyes from the television, but the broken eyes from the cafe. The eyes of a 14-year-old orphan still hiding inside a 36-year-old kingpin. And she understood she was angry at him for the truth. But she couldn't hate him for the pain. Because Sera Nakamura knew what loneliness looked like. And it didn't change whether you lived in a Dorchester studio or a Beacon Hill penthouse. Victor Sorokin didn't become the Eastern boss by overlooking details. From the moment Cormac woke up, Sorokin had men tracking every move his rival made. And it didn't take long for an unusual report to surface. Cormac Riley, a man who never saw the same woman twice, had met a hospital janitor twice in 2 weeks. And both times the boss had gone without his full security detail. Only Dex at his side. As if he didn't want to frighten her. Sorokin dug deeper. Within days he had a name, an address, a work schedule, and grainy photos of Sera pushing Hannah's stroller along Dead Avenue in Dorchester. And he smiled. Because in 30 years of this life, he'd learned that no matter how powerful a man was, he always had a weakness. And Cormac Riley's weakness wasn't an empire or territory or money. It was a thin janitor and her small daughter. Sera sensed something was wrong on the third night. A black sedan parked across the street from her building, headlights still on, appeared at 10 at night when she came home from her shift and was still there at 4 in the morning when she woke to feed Hannah. The first night, she told herself it was a neighbor's guest. The second night, unease crept in. The third night, she stood behind the curtain and saw the red glow of a cigarette inside the car, and knew someone was sitting there watching her window. She closed the curtain, locked the door twice, slid the safety bolt, then sat on the bed holding Hannah, and didn't sleep until dawn. Then came the seventh night. Sera came home close to midnight after her shift, carrying Hannah asleep from Mrs. Kim's place. Opened the apartment door, turned on the light, and knew immediately someone had been inside. Not because anything was disturbed or a lock was broken. Everything looked normal. But there was the faint smell of unfamiliar men's cologne in a room that usually smelled only of baby formula and cleaning solution. Then she saw it. On Hannah's pillow, where her daughter slept every night beside the one-eyed stuffed fox, lay a single red rose, placed perfectly in the center. Petals fresh, stem neatly cut, like it came from an expensive florist. There was no card, no note. None was needed. Because the message was clearer than any threat. We know where your daughter sleeps. We can enter your home whenever we want. And next time it might not be a flower. Sera looked at the rose and her body reacted before her mind could. Her knees buckled. Her arms clutched Hannah so tightly the child woke and began to cry. And Sera ran into the bathroom, the only room with a lock, shut the door, slid to the cold tile floor with her back against the tub, and held Hannah while they both cried. She sat there for an hour, shaking uncontrollably, until Hannah finally cried herself back to sleep against her chest. And in the darkness, Sera thought through every option she had. Call the police. And say what? That someone left a flower on my child's pillow? They'd laugh at her. Move away. But where, and with what money? Run. But run to where, when she had no family, no friends, no one in the world except the child sleeping against her? Then she thought of Cormac. She thought of what he'd said in the cafe. She thought of those fractured eyes. And she hated herself for what she was about to do. But she did it, because she was a mother. And mothers do whatever they must. Sera pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called the only number she had. Dex answered on the first ring, like always. And Sera said in a voice she tried to steady and failed, "Someone's been in my apartment. Someone left a flower on my child's pillow. I need help." Dex didn't ask a single question. He just said, "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone." 15 minutes. Exactly 15 minutes later, there was a knock. Dex's voice said, "It's me." Sera opened the door. Dex stood there with two other men. One immediately swept the apartment, while the other stood guard in the hallway. And Dex looked at the rose on the pillow, looked at Sera's face, then said, "Leave now. Take what the child needs. Don't bring anything else." 20 minutes later, Sera sat in the back seat of a black SUV, holding Hannah wrapped in a blanket, watching the city slide past the window in the night. She didn't know where they were going until the car stopped in front of a high-rise on Beacon Hill and Dex led her into a private elevator straight to the top floor. The elevator doors opened onto the penthouse. And Cormac stood there. No suit, no boss persona, just a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark trousers, hair uncombed, eyes showing he hadn't slept either, though it was nearly 2 in the morning. He looked at Sera stepping out with Hannah in her arms, face drained of color, eyes swollen red, hands still shaking. The child curled against her chest, clutching the one-eyed stuffed fox in restless sleep. And something on Cormac's face broke. Not softened like in the hospital room. Not fractured like in the cafe. But shattered completely, like a wall he'd built over 22 years since his father died, collapsing in a single instant at the sight of a woman trembling with her child because his world had touched her life. Cormac stepped forward. Didn't touch Sera, because he knew she wasn't ready for that. But stood close enough for her to know he was there. And he said to Dex in a voice that wasn't loud, but carried the weight of stone in every word, "Find Sorokin. End this." Dex nodded once and stepped back into the elevator. And in the weeks that followed, Viktor Sorokin's network was dismantled piece by piece in ways only the underworld ever learned the details of. No one spoke of what finally happened to Sorokin. No one asked. And when his name stopped appearing in any conversation, in any bar or restaurant in the city, everyone understood that Cormac Riley had proven once again why he was the boss. And that anyone who touched what he protected would pay not with territory or money, but with everything. A week after Sorokin vanished from the underworld map, Finn Riley came to Cormac's penthouse on a Sunday afternoon, not to discuss strategy or sign papers, but because Cormac had called and said his brother should come for dinner. Just that. And Finn came, because it was the first time in more than 10 years Cormac had invited him without an agenda. They sat in the wide living room overlooking the Boston Common, 2 glasses of Irish whiskey on the table, and for the first time in a very long while, the 2 brothers talked like brothers instead of twin pillars of an empire trying not to collapse. Finn said that the night before the 72 hours ended, after he signed the papers to remove the ventilator and finished the meeting with the Copos, he drove home, parked in the garage, shut off the engine, and sat in the dark for 3 hours. He said he cried. Cried for the first time since their father's funeral 22 years earlier. Cried not because he feared losing the organization, but because he realized he was about to let his brother die without the 2 of them ever having said a single truly important thing to each other beyond numbers and strategy. Cormac listened and didn't know how to respond, because the Riley family hadn't taught its sons how to answer honesty. But he put a hand on Finn's shoulder and held it there. And Finn put his hand over his brother's. And then the 2 men who had been hard their entire lives hugged, for the first time since standing beside their father's coffin. A brief and awkward embrace in the way of men who weren't used to holding anyone. But real. More real than any handshake or nod they'd shared in 20 years. Finn left at 9 in the evening. When the elevator doors closed, the penthouse returned to 3 people: Cormac, Sera, and Hannah. Sera and Hannah had been there for more than a week since the night of the flower on the pillow. Cormac had given them a private guest suite with a locking door so Sera would feel safe. He kept a respectful distance, never entering when the door was closed, never touching Sera or Hannah unless invited. But Hannah didn't understand distance. She was nearly 2. And the penthouse was the most magical kingdom her small feet had ever explored. She ran everywhere, touching everything with the fearless curiosity of a child who didn't yet know the world could hurt her. And that evening, while Sera washed dishes in the kitchen, Hannah found Cormac. He was sitting alone on the terrace overlooking the city, his second glass of whiskey in hand. The Boston lights reflected in his pale green eyes. Thinking about his conversation with Finn. About wasted years. About words never spoken. When he heard tiny footsteps padding across the stone floor. Hannah stood in the doorway looking at him with wide eyes, the one-eyed stuffed fox tucked under her arm. And she wasn't shy or afraid. She simply walked straight to Cormac and climbed into his lap with the natural ease of a child who believed every set of arms was a safe place. Cormac froze. He set the whiskey down too quickly and didn't know what to do with his arms. Hands that had held guns, struck blows, signed orders of destruction, now being grabbed by a child not yet 2 years old, tugging at his index finger. Hannah held his hand, pulled it toward the sky, pointed up, and said in a small, clear, proud voice, "Suki." The moon hung over Boston, not full, just a thin crescent. But Hannah looked at it as if it were the most beautiful thing in the universe. Then turned back to Cormac, waiting for confirmation. Waiting for him to say, "Yes, that's the moon." Because that was how she shared joy with the adults in her life. Cormac looked down at the tiny face lifted toward him, and didn't know what to do with this gentleness or where to place it in a life built of violence and shadow. But he heard himself say softly, "Suki." And Hannah laughed, the way children laugh when an adult understands them. Then she rested her head against his chest and sat quietly watching the moon, holding his finger and not letting go. Sera stood in the darkness behind the glass door, her hands still wet with dishwater, and she saw everything. She saw the most powerful mob boss on the eastern seaboard sitting perfectly still on the terrace for fear a sudden movement might startle the child on his lap. She saw hands that had committed terrible acts cradling her daughter's tiny fingers. And she saw the real person behind Cormac Riley, the 14-year-old orphan who'd never been held, who had become something dangerous to survive, now being taught by a stranger's child how to touch the world without destroying it. In the days that followed, affection grew among the three of them at the slow pace of the moon changing shape each night. Cormac cooked pasta for Hannah at 2 in the morning when she woke hungry. Standing in his $1 million kitchen, boiling noodles in a pot he had to Google how to use because he'd never cooked anything himself before. He read to Hannah every night at bedtime, his voice stiff and awkward because he wasn't used to reading aloud. But Hannah didn't care whether the voice was good or bad. She just needed someone there. And he read until she fell asleep. Then kept reading a few more pages, because he didn't want to stop. Some nights, Sera and Cormac sat in the kitchen drinking coffee after Hannah slept, their hands accidentally brushing when they reached for the pot at the same time, both pulling back at once and pretending nothing had happened. Though both knew something had. And neither was ready to name it. Then one night, Hannah said his name in her sleep. She lay in the crib in the guest room, hugging the one-eyed stuffed fox, eyes closed. And the word Mac slipped from her small lips in a dreamy whisper, natural and easy, as if the name belonged in her safe vocabulary alongside Mama and Suki. Cormac was standing in the doorway, checking on her before bed, a habit he couldn't remember when he'd started. And he heard his name from the mouth of a sleeping child and stood there a long time without moving. Then tears ran down his face. Not many, just 2, one on each side. But they were the first tears Cormac Riley had shed since the day his father died. And he let them fall. Because no one was watching. But Sera saw. She stood in the hallway behind him and saw the tears on the cheeks of the man the underworld feared. And she said nothing. Didn't wipe them away or touch him. She simply stepped forward and sat beside him on the floor outside Hannah's room, her shoulder against his. And sat there in silence. And Cormac sat there in silence. And together they watched the child sleep through the cracked door. And no one spoke, because there was nothing that needed saying. And that was enough. In the months that followed, Cormac Riley did something no one in the underworld thought he ever would. He began to walk away from it. Not abruptly or naively, because Cormac understood an empire built on blood couldn't be dismantled overnight. But he started redirecting each segment toward legitimacy. Real estate that was truly real estate. Restaurants that made honest profit. Investments in technology and healthcare. Finn was the first to notice the shift. And for the first time in his life, he looked at his younger brother not with worry, but with hope. Then rolled up his sleeves and did what he did best, turning vision into numbers. What surprised Dex and Finn and everyone around Cormac, even more than the legalization of the organization, was the foundation. Cormac founded it with his own clean money, named it the Hannah Foundation, and defined its mission with the same clarity he used when giving orders. To build free child care systems inside hospitals for night shift workers, so no mother would ever have to bring a sick child to work because there was no one to watch them. To provide emergency support for single-mother families on the brink. And to run domestic violence prevention programs to help women find a way out before it was too late. When Cormac offered Sera the role of executive director for the second time, she didn't refuse. Not because her circumstances had changed or because she'd softened toward money, but because this time she understood it wasn't charity. It was a mission she believed in. A mission written in her own life. In nights carrying a sick child to work because there was no one to help. In moments backed into corners with no rescue. And she told Cormac she accepted because she wanted to make sure no mother ever had to live what she had lived. And Cormac nodded. Because he didn't need any other reason. 6 months after Cormac Riley opened his eyes in a hospital bed, he stood in the new office of the Hannah Foundation, a renovated warehouse in South Boston, chosen because it sat in the heart of the community rather than inside a glass tower in the financial district detached from reality. The warehouse walls were covered with children's drawings from the neighborhood. Photographs of families the foundation had helped. And at the center of the largest wall was a mural Sera had completed with the neighborhood children over the past month. A star-filled night sky with a large golden moon at its center, surrounded by hundreds of small, colorful handprints from children who had pressed their hands to the wall and left their mark on the world. Hannah ran through the office, tiny feet pattering across the polished concrete floor, the one-eyed stuffed fox tucked under her arm as always. And she ran straight to Cormac, grabbed his hand, and pulled him along, because she had something important to show. Cormac let her lead, his long stride slowing to match her small steps. And Hannah stopped in front of the mural, pointed to a small blue handprint just to the left of the moon, and said with the most serious voice a nearly 2-year-old could manage, "That's Hannah's." Cormac knelt to her eye level, looked at the tiny handprint on the wall, then at Hannah, and said, "It's beautiful. Just like you." Sera stood on the other side of the room watching them, her heart so full she had to breathe deeply. In 6 months, they had hired a 12-person team, built child care systems in 5 hospitals, provided emergency support to more than 300 families. And they were only getting started. But more than the numbers, they had become a family. Not a traditional family. Not one anyone would have predicted. But a real one, built from late-night pasta cooking, bedtime stories, shoulders touching in silence outside a sleeping child's room. Cormac looked up at Sera across the room. And between them was the invisible thread her grandmother had taught her about when she was little, the thread she now knew was real. Then Cormac called out, "Come here. Hannah says we all have to put our handprints on the wall." The 3 of them stood before the mural. Sera opened the paint box and one by one they dipped their hands into the paint and pressed them onto the wall beside the golden moon. Hannah's tiny blue handprint was already there. Sera's handprint was smaller, slender fingers pressed in silver. Cormac's handprint was the largest, pressed in dark green. The same hand still marked with calluses from years of holding the wrong things. Now smeared with paint and the laughter of a nearly 2-year-old clapping when she saw the grown-ups follow her lead. 3 handprints of different sizes lay side by side, overlapping slightly at the edges, forming their own small constellation on the wall among hundreds of others. But these 3 belonged together in a way that didn't need explaining. Hannah looked up at the mural, saw the large golden moon in the painted night sky, and pointed up, saying, "Suki," in the same voice that 6 months earlier had reached a man lost in a coma and kept him from drifting away. Cormac and Sera answered together, "Suki," then looked at each other and smiled, a soft smile shared by 2 people who had walked through too much darkness not to cherish every fragment of light, no matter how small. And they stood there beneath a painted sky full of stars and dreams, 3 souls who had found each other in the dark and pulled one another into the light, hand in hand, ready to spend the rest of their lives helping others find their own constellation in the night. Because sometimes the most miraculous magic doesn't come from medicine or money or power, but from the simplest and most revolutionary act of all, treating one another with kindness. We are all connected by invisible threads. And when you tug gently on one, somewhere someone will feel it. And if you're lucky, they'll tug back. This story reminds us that kindness is never wasted, no matter who you give it to. That compassion has the power to heal wounds the entire world can't fix. That no one is too rich to need love. And no one is too poor to give it. True family isn't always defined by blood, but is sometimes born from the most unexpected moments, when 2 strangers decide to care about each other without needing a reason.